Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti, anche da parte mia, per questo importante seminario nazionale e internazionale che la professoressa Polenghi ha voluto fortemente realizzare, nonostante le difficoltà, nonostante tutto, proprio per dare un segnale importante di come la ricerca pedagogica italiana, nonostante la situazione, sia andata avanti. Dobbiamo dire che in questa situazione di crisi anche le università hanno dimostrato di saper reagire prontamente, sia sul piano tecnico, ma soprattutto sul piano anche della ricerca, come dimostra la giornata di oggi. È un panorama ovviamente delle diverse aree della ricerca pedagogica, da quelle più generali a quelle storiche, a quelle didattiche e sperimentali, quindi un panorama ampio, significativo e soprattutto questa dimensione internazionale che non poteva iniziare in modo più autorevole attraverso la presenza del professor O'Hara, che ringrazio anch'io moltissimo per la sua presenza. Il rapporto con l'EERA in questi anni è cresciuto e si è consolidato, la sua presenza qui oggi è davvero importante. Io non voglio rubare tempo perché il programma è molto serrato, voglio ringraziarlo fortemente. Many thanks Professor O'Hara della Dublin City University, Presidente EERA, che presenta una relazione sul Educational Research in Disrupted Times, Challenges and Opportunities. Quindi insomma un quadro sulla ricerca educativa in questi tempi, come dire, interrotti, sospesi, frammentati. Quindi grazie, many thanks Professor O'Hara. You can speak.
Professor Fiorucci, facciamo una prova che il professor O'Hara ha un attimo problemi di audio, di video. Vediamo se riusciamo ad andare in audio e andrà in condivisione della presentazione.
Benissimo.
Professor O'Hara, could you switch on your microphone, please?
Yes, my microphone is on. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. I share your presentation now.
Okay, thank you.
Your presentation is on.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the honor of inviting me to speak to the Siped conference today. It is a great honor. It's one that I've been looking forward to for quite a while, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to represent EERA at this, the European Educational Research Association. And the topic that I've decided to speak to, I think, is one that I hope makes sense to all of us, which is looking at the place that educational research now holds in, I think, what we now euphemistically call challenging times or disrupted times or the new times, and to try and think through where we as educational researchers can position ourselves as our world changes or as our world goes through this huge change. So can I go to the next slide, please? Just to begin with, and I'm sure many of you know about EERA, but a very brief introduction to EERA. So EERA is an association of associations, the European Educational Research Association. We have 42 member associations from 37 countries or regions, and we represent approximately 20,000 researchers, give or take, who are split up into 33 academic networks. And of course, Siped is a very active member of it and represented on our council wonderfully by Elisabetta Bifi. And we tried to bring together researchers from across Europe to bring a specifically European approach to education. Perhaps the next slide, please. And that's at the core of what we think about, is a European approach. Next slide, please, if we could. And of course, Siped has had a very important role in this. In 2018, our major annual event, which is a European Conference on Educational Research, was held in Bolzano, and it was one of the best conferences we've ever had, but I think everybody agrees with that idea. It's very important to me as well personally, because it's when I took over as president of EERA. But it was a fantastic conference, and it did what ESERs are meant to do, which it brought a European community of researchers together to a specific place within Europe and brought the ideas and the concerns and the knowledge of a local research community to that wider organization. So that's very important to us. So Easter is very important. The next slide, please, if we can. And so today, what I want to try and do is reflect on what it means to be and to do research in these strange times. EERA has as its motto, or as its vision statement, its mission statement, to engage in high quality research for the benefit of education and society. But over the last year, I mean, well, since February or March, at least of this year, we've begun to see the enormous challenges that places on us, particularly in a time when all of society, globally, locally, regionally, nationally, has been challenged in ways that it hasn't been before. So it's been a real time of questioning for us, both in terms of what we do, but in terms of how we do it. And it's been a time of real precarity for us and a time of real challenge for us. Next slide, please. And what we've been thinking about is, yes, it's a time of huge change, but it's also a time now where there will be increasing pressures as the wonderful news about vaccines emerges and the wonderful news about thinking about getting out of this. There'll be a challenge then, where do we go to next? Having made perhaps radical short-term changes, will we be moving back to the normal where we were, or will there be a new normal, to use a phrase that we hear all about? So where do we actually go with this, and how does this actually work? And if we go to the next slide, I think what we begin to think about in relation to that is that we've been doing this for a long time. So at last I get to quote Gramsci in an Italian conference, one of the great pleasures of my life. But he was talking about back in the 30s in relation to, I think, a reality where we might be facing now. That in the context of broader society perhaps, but also in the context of what we do as educational researchers, what has happened before is probably gone. We can't go back to where we were on December 4th, 2019, but we don't really know where we're going to, and we don't really know what's going to happen. And we're in this very strange interregnum at the moment. We're in this period which is very unusual for us, and we need to think about how do we move forward. And as educational researchers, we need to look at how do we become part of that conversation. And if we move on to the next slide, in Australia, the Dean of Monash University, Viv Ellis, came up with a very interesting analysis of what's happening in teacher education around these last 7 or 8 months. And what he said was, effectively, there's two phases going on in this. The first phase that we did as researchers and practitioners in education was we stabilized where we were. Around February, March, or April, we looked at what we were doing and we came up with ways of just maintaining what we do in a facsimile or an approximate way of operating. And now we're rethinking practices. So perhaps this is what's happened to us collectively. We've been involved in stabilization, and perhaps we've moved into rethinking. And that's a big challenge to us, because we're doing this almost simultaneously. We're doing the stabilization and the rethinking at the same time. And as we know as researchers, that's a very complex thing to be doing. And if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to look at that in relation to say one specific aspect that our network 16 was looking at, which is the ICT in education and learning, which is technology supported learning. I know Italy will be the same as virtually everywhere else in Europe in relation to this, that we've had this, what we call in English, to pivot to online, that everything, this was the solution, this was the panacea, this was going to save us in terms of higher education, primary education, secondary education, further education. So we had this rapid integration of technology into what we did. And of course, there was lots of questions about it, like where was the resourcing for this? And we'll see in a few moments how big a challenge that is. We sort of have to think about, well, how did we do this? Was it a radical redesigning of what we did, a rethinking, to use Ellis's idea? Was it a repurposing of what we did? Or was it, as some researchers in the field suggest, it was just a transition of what we do from a physical space to an online space, and not taking taking any advantage of what was going on. And that's a big challenge as well. And then, of course, there's these challenges. There's the infrastructural challenges. For many places within Europe, and as we look across EERA, there's been hugely different experiences in terms of the capacity of the technological infrastructure to manage this enormous switch in mode of delivery. There's also been huge pedagogical challenges. Many of us are not expert in online teaching and learning, and trying to find ways of doing that at every single level of education has been massively complex and massively complicated. And then there's the major societal challenges. Is there a capacity to support this type of learning at this type of level? And if we'll see on the next slide, these challenges, of course, are really important when it comes to those parts of society that maybe are already disadvantaged. So this is just something I picked up very briefly from the OECD, which was looking at the skills that teachers have to teach disadvantaged students, to teach in disadvantaged schools. And you can see that students are disadvantaged socioeconomically already. And then they have this double disadvantage that the people who are teaching them don't have the digital skills necessarily to teach to the high level in an online environment. And then the third disadvantage, if we go to the next slide, has been really made worse in this last phase. And the conceptualization of digital poverty and the challenge of digital poverty is becoming a really major one. And the slide there is just taken from Andreas Schleicher a couple of weeks ago, talking about the way in which schools have the increased advantage in advantaged schools in the delivery of education in this period because of the societally based digital poverty. And at a NEERA perspective, bringing it back to research, an awful lot of the research that we've seen done and around access and poverty and disadvantage is being repurposed very quickly to look at the role of digital poverty. And we've seen examples of this in Scotland, England, Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, I'm sure Italy as well, I know in Ireland as well. So this is an example of how researchers are being very agile and switching into a different area, thinking about repurposing. And on the next slide, I think what you begin to see is how we actually do things. So what we're beginning to see across a whole range of areas, but sticking with the digital for a while, is a research response to this. So we're looking at, and this is something done in Northern Ireland and the other part of my island, we're looking at baseline data, we're looking at interpretation, and we're looking at policy formation. So this is happening throughout Europe. And as our EERA networks now get together for looking at projects and looking at our conference next year, you can begin to see that the type of material that people are talking about is coming around this. They're looking at the baseline data, desperately trying to find out what's happening. I'm not quite sure what it's like in Italy, but in Ireland, Irish school leaders are saying, please stop sending us surveys, finding out what's happening. We're just trying to do our job. But of course, we as researchers feel the need to do that. And then of course, we interpret it and then we try to bring it into a policy space. And if we move to the next slide, we'll talk about that in a second. And of course, in Italy, you've almost been ahead of the curve on this. Your colleague and our colleague on EERJ, Paolo Landri, has been talking about a very interesting approach to this, which is what's the governance architecture in relation to the use of increased technology within education. And this is a book that was written before COVID, but in a review that was just done a couple of days ago, it really talks about how this is really prescient. This is a type of a paper and a type of a book which is challenging us to think about these core issues. And if we move on to the next slide, you can begin to see maybe some of the wider questions that we need to think about. And I think what EERA would argue, and I think what we as education researchers would argue, that perhaps this is a time to move away from the technical stabilization and to begin to think about a wider response to the use of technology in education. So we should be bringing ethicists in, philosophers in, evaluators in, data scientists, sociologists, the whole range of those different disciplines or sub-areas that feed into our associations, our national educational research associations, and talk about, well, what exactly does it mean to make this enormous transition in what we're doing in education? And the analogy I would take would be to 15 or 20 years ago when we had the first appearance of technology technology in broader society with Facebooks and Twitters and that, when we didn't do this, when we left technology be almost a value-free area of technical experts who showed us what things could do without asking about why they're doing it. And I think in terms of educational research, this is one of the areas we need to really focus on, and it's an area that EERA is very interested in. And if we move on to the next slide, we can begin to think about maybe some other areas. Because at a broad level around Europe, what you're beginning, I think, to see is a re-emergence or a rethinking or a reconceptualization of the educational ecosystem, which is a phrase increasingly we're being seen used. And a few of the areas that we see in EERA as becoming important. The first one is, say, the permeability of educational spaces. Maybe the last 6 to 9 months has shown us the way in which schools are embedded in communities, and the walls that maybe traditionally might have been around schools and educational spaces in general are less strict than they might have been. So there's a much greater call now for parental voice and student voice in education. There's a much greater acknowledgement that external stakeholders have a large role to play within education and in how we could think about it. And at a very practical level, there was the fact that in many countries in Europe and around the world, the educational space became the home. It became the dining table or the kitchen table when children weren't in school. Now, that's maybe not as much the case now, but it's definitely in many places still happening. So it's a much more permeable space. In many European countries, I'm unsure about Italy, but I know definitely in the northwest corner of Europe, we had what's known as the assessment crisis or the assessment debacle, where terminal school examinations could not be run in a traditional manner, which are written examinations. And instead, new modes of technical analysis of results were made, which gave students end of school terminal examination results. And there were massive challenges about this. There were technical challenges in the capacity of how do you actually do this in a system which maybe doesn't have the data to make the results on. But there was also social and political implications there, because in many countries, for the first time, there was a huge questioning about, well, what are the decisions made around the construction of end of school assessment, and how do we place a value on the work of students at all levels of our education systems? And the trade-offs that we as educational experts may be aware of in relation to the design of exam systems and curricula, some were for the first time brought front and center into the social and political discussions. And this has been an enormously important debate in many of our member countries. And then, of course, there's maybe to use the OECD's phrase of transversal skills. There's a real question about, well, what exactly are we doing? What skills do people need in this transitioning world? What skills do people need to look at to succeed in a world that is as contingent as we've seen it being over the last 6 to 9 months? And which gets us into major questions that many of our member countries are asking. Well, what's the purpose of education? Has it changed, and will it need to change in the post-pandemic world? And these are enormous questions, and they're questions that are happening at a social level, and they're questions that are happening about education that I think we as education researchers need to have a role in, and from an EERA perspective, because we see our research benefiting education and society, we really want to be at the center of that. And if we look on the next slide, we perhaps see one of the other challenges that we think about, and that is, I mean, we're unapologetic in EERA in that one of our major focuses on our emerging researchers, our younger researchers. And the research ecosystem is under a huge amount of pressure, enormous pressure. So if we look across the European level and world level as well, emerging researcher precarity or lack of a secure pathway to jobs is becoming a huge issue. In one survey done for Nature, the international magazine, 70% of early career researchers were on short-term contracts. So that's a scary figure. And this just isn't like early career researchers aren't just those in their early 20s as we may have been in this thing. They're in different European countries. Some people are on short-term contracts in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. So how can you build an academic community and a structure to support that? There's the other challenge as well, that in many countries the research ecosystem is monocultural. It's very difficult for people from different cultural or ethnic backgrounds to break into it, and that's a major challenge as Europe becomes an increasingly diversified place, as we've seen as one of the major themes of the last 5-10 years within Europe. There's the whole challenge then of researcher well-being, not just emerging researchers, although it seems to hit on them particularly bad, working in environments that are enormously challenging and to an extent toxic as well. There's a major issue in relation to the nature of social science and humanities funding that education draws from. The phrase a Cinderella type background is problematic, and even you've seen in the latest round of Horizon Europe conversations, while there were some technical changes in the way social science and humanities researchers access funding, it's still a small amount of funding in the overall hierarchy of funding, and this is a major challenge to us as educational researchers. And then for those of us who work in higher education, the market model of funding in higher education, which has been dominant in many European countries, is now falling away because many of the international students who are used to fund the activities of indigenous and local students aren't coming because of the COVID pandemic. And this is a massive challenge as well. How do we fund it and how do we do it? And on the next slide, if we think about then, well, how do we involve ourselves in this? And this is a huge challenge for EERA. And it's how do you get a policy input? How do we as education researchers find a place where we can actually talk about what we know and present what we know to those who make the decisions in a whole range of educational spaces? And there's a number of challenges we face here. One is the nature of educational research. It's what we do and how we do it, linking to the nature of the evidence that we provide. I think it's a challenge of all experts like ourselves, is that we see the complexity and we understand the nuances, but the people who we're presenting to quite often don't want complexity or nuance. They want answers and solutions. And there's a big challenge there for us in how we do this. And how do we present policy and how do we create this policy? So there's a whole evidence-based policy or policy-based evidence idea. And there's a huge challenge throughout Europe in relation to this and how we talk about this. And I think the argument might be that we're something of a wasted resource, or at least EERA would have a sense of that. And if we look on the next slide, you can see though that Siped, for example, you are probably leading the charge in this in relation to your policy input and your capacity to engage directly with those decision makers. And I think this is a very exciting initiative, and one that I'm sure we'll hear more about at a European level. Now, if we go on to the next slide, I think one of the challenges, and I just want to I'll run through these relatively briefly. One of the challenges that we have is the sheer complexity of education. So the European Alliance of Social Science and Humanities that EERA is part of, and Siped is part of through us, did a really interesting job mapping education journals in recent times, and this is the educational mapping. These are the topics that appear in Scopus journals around education. So like an extraordinary number of areas and sub areas and ideas, and you can see big ones like teacher, student, learning, school, that type of thing. If we go on to the next slide, they'll show us what it's like in, and this isn't in any way critical of sociology, but that's sociology. And the next slide is law. So if we see the next slide, then you can begin to see the challenge of the three areas that we have. So education is very complex. The sociology one is less complex. And if we can move on to the next slide. Law is even less complex. So I think this gives you some challenge that we as researchers in the education sphere can have when we're trying to engage and we're trying to discuss in that way. So if we move to the next slide then. Sorry, the next slide, please. So just another one to throw out there as well. I think we're coming towards the end, so we won't spend too much time on it, but the well-being agenda is an enormous one of real interest around Europe also. The awareness of well-being to successful education for all of us involved in it, and issues around poverty and access and support, and the whole continuum of education, sort of trying to reconsider what we do as educators across the whole life cycle of the educational profession, from the earliest days when we begin in our educational careers right through the end. And how do we continue to bring the richness of that, and how do we continue to bring research evidence to this? And the last number of months have demonstrated the real knowledge that education is more than transmission of knowledge and information and skills, that the whole well-being, the whole understanding of social and interpersonal well-being being at the core of what we do has been brought out for us, I think. So the next slide, please. So where do we go in the future? Well, as we think about it, I mean, and this could change next week, so let's think about it. I think there is that, what I would call the seductive challenge of getting back to normal. There will be an enormous amount of calls, and maybe it'll be something that we want to do ourselves, to go back to where we were. But the real answer is, given how much we know about what was wrong with the normal in the past, why would we want to go back there? And why would we want to recreate a structure that many of us felt was a challenging structure beforehand? So how do we move away from those siren voices, and how do we as educational researchers contribute to that? The next thing is then, what type of research do we do? There's a great call now for rapid focused research. Sorry, could we go back? There's a great call for rapid focused research, and there's a great call for getting stuff done really quickly. But we also need to as researchers, think about what we're doing in a longer term. So how do we engage in this type of research? How do we record what's happening? One of the big challenges that I think we have at the moment is there's so much innovation going on, firefighting innovation, if I can call it that, where we're making really incredible innovative solutions to issues that we're trying to solve in the immediate. But how do we lose them? Do they fall away? So there's an example of the World Pandemic Research Network, which is trying to store all of these ideas. There's a challenge to expand about what we think about and involve other voices, and particularly involve voices from the South, those that are traditionally saying, and from the non-Anglophone world. There is an increasing dominant, and I say this realizing that I'm an Irishman speaking in English, but there's an increasing dominance of ways of thinking and ways of doing that are from the Anglophone world. And that's a challenge, because we lose the richness, excuse me, of contextual knowledge, of contextually embedded ways of doing things, and just of different traditions that challenge the way those of us who speak English and work in this English-speaking world do things. And finally, there's the need for community. How do we continue and create and make this community at the core of what it is that we do? And that's, of course, where organizations like Siped and hopefully EERA create that community space, because at the heart of what we do is the capacity to work with and to develop with each other. So we could go to the next slide. This is a few advertisements here. Of course, our community is based around Easter. We can't have a face-to-face conference next year, but we would encourage all of you, if you can, to meet with us online around our conference in Geneva, where there will be some aspects of it held. And the call for papers just went out 2 days ago, actually. So we hope many of you can do that. And then on to my next and final slide. EERA has also developed an EERA blog, which we've developed. Sorry, just on the next slide, there's information on it. The EERA blog, which is trying to bring together the opportunity for people to think about and to work through different aspects of educational research in a slightly less formal environment and reporting environment. So we'd be delighted if you could join the EERA blog as well. So thank you very much for listening and for your time, and thank you to the excellent slide changer for doing that as well. So thanks for your time. Thank you.
Beh, molto bene, molte grazie. Many thanks, Professor O'Hara, veramente anche per questa ricchissima relazione, anche per tutti gli stimoli. Non abbiamo il tempo di commentare, ma veramente grazie anche per il rispetto dei tempi. Siamo in perfetto orario, quindi io non voglio essere causa di ritardi e sforamenti. Nel ringraziare ancora una volta il professor O'Hara, passo la parola veramente al professor Elia per la sessione successiva, e quindi grazie e buon proseguimento.